Welcome, I'm Eric Rhodes with Siemens Energy, and today we're going to have a discussion with cybersecurity and how it relates to critical infrastructure. I have with us today Marty Edwards with Tenable and Jonathan Tubb with Siemens Energy. So if you gentlemen want to introduce yourselves and let us know what you do.
Yeah, great. My name is Marty Edwards. I'm the Deputy Chief Technology Officer for Operational Technology at Tenable.
Thanks for being here today, Marty. My name is Jonathan Tubb. I'm Director of Industrial Cybersecurity with Siemens Energy.
Excellent. So we have some of the two best heads in this space talking with us today. So today we will look more about cybersecurity and how it relates to critical infrastructure and the current trends, whether they're either good or bad. So let's start on topic one. As we're closing out this year in 2023, and what we could talk about what we've seen, and then also, if we don't mind discussing what potentially we're going to see in 2024. So Marty, I'm going to go ahead and lead off with you.
2023, we could call almost the year of ransomware. So all cybersecurity oriented companies or production companies need to be really concerned about the rise of what I always want to put the word criminal in front of ransomware, right? Ransomware isn't some sort of hackers, breaking into your system just for fun or enjoyment. And it's typically not a nation state that's trying to do something to you. It's organized crime, right? And we've seen case after case after case of this happen. And it's costing industry an extraordinary amount of money. So I think if you look backwards into 2023, you can definitely see this inflection point. Unfortunately, for my perspective, I guess, from an automation perspective or a control system perspective, I think we're going to see a continued increase in targeting of production or energy-related facilities. Because quite frankly, that's where the money is, right? It's one thing to take the email system offline for a company or hold their data for ransom so you can have extortion, you can kind of release the data and that fear. It's another thing entirely to take a factory's production systems offline or to shut down an energy system. Those systems are, quite frankly, what we depend on every single day. And so they can demand a much higher ransom.
That's absolutely true. And I think most 3- and 4-letter agencies, threat intelligence sharing communities would agree that this was the year of ransomware, and especially ransomware that was able to affect operational technology. And it's interesting, the second order impacts that's had on the industry. Obviously, everybody's concerned about, what happens if I'm a victim of ransomware? And of course, there's the reputational risks that come along with it. But practically speaking, what I'm seeing, at least through some of the organizations that I interact with, is a choice or a decision on where that risk lies in their organization. And it's led to some interesting industry trends where traditionally executives, CISOs have, addressed risk by outsourcing that insurance or, third-party management. And now they're forced into this position where they may have to self-insure, or they simply can't keep up with the demands of their third-party risk management. Because, at the end of the day, whether you're an end user of this equipment, operational technology, or an OEM, right, we all have to deal with the same risks, the same threat landscape. So it's been an interesting problem.
It has.
Now, I'm curious too, right? We've seen all this happen in 2023, but what does that mean for 2024, right? What do we do with the information and knowledge that we've gained in the last year?
Yeah, I think at this point, every facility manager, plant manager, security director needs to clearly understand that they have to buy this risk down somehow, right? And we can talk about it a little bit more extensively, but the tendency has been in the past to deal with things after they happen. And I think you need to invest a lot more in ensuring these things don't happen, because the cost of cleaning something up is going to be orders of magnitude higher than preventing them in the first place.
Absolutely. And, I couldn't agree with that more. I think you touched on an interesting topic there just very briefly, and it's something that I'm passionate about. And where is your revenue coming from? right? You look at an operational technology company, right? And usually that, I'm talking critical infrastructure, manufacturing, whatever that is, right? And there's usually a really, really heavy investment in these business systems, right? And you will have all types of advanced tooling, continuous monitoring, all the way up to the very edge of that thing that is actually generating revenue for your company, right? We get right to the plant firewalls and then we stop suddenly. And it creates this interesting problem of if we find ourselves in an event, and it's that reactive concept that you were talking about, what do we do if we don't have visibility into a system, right? Our decision making is impacted in that moment because we don't have the visibility to say, is this system compromised or not? And I think it's something that we critically need to change that mindset. We've been so focused in the operational technology space on safety, reliability, uptime and availability, as opposed to the traditional CIA model that we see on the IT side.
Yeah, and I think a couple points. The first one, I predict that we're going to continue to see production in industrial facilities be targeted, and it's kind of a cliche, I guess, but they asked the bank robber back in the 1800s, I think, why do you rob banks? And the guy said, well, that's where the money is. And so you hit the nail on the head, right? It's one thing having a business system compromise and having a leak of data, but when you can take an online production facility down, that raises the stakes significantly. So if you go back and look at some of these incidents, like Colonial Pipelines, for example, right? They shut their system down voluntarily out of an abundance of caution because they didn't have the visibility that maybe they should have into that environment. So what I think I would promote is if you have increased visibility to know for certain that this operational system is not impacted by something that's happening in your business environment, you can work through that. You can continue to operate through that disruption, right? And with the interconnection of the business and information technology systems to the operational technology systems that we're sharing data every single day, you need to have extremely good visibility into those environments.
So that brings up some really good topics of discussion, specifically around the money generation and how to protect that with the insurance. So Jonathan, if you want to lead us on the topic of insurance right now with cybersecurity and power generation and critical infrastructure, and what we're seeing in the market and how those trends are going to change.
Yeah, so this is something that is kind of near and dear to my heart because we live in a late stage capitalist society. Unfortunately, the first thing that we have to address is risk, and when I say risk, I mean money, right? And traditionally, IT security programs have been very robust and focused on business continuity and continuing to generate revenue. Whereas, now we're starting to see operational technology environments fold into that same concept, right? And traditionally, insurers, underwriters have looked at simply one side of the business, and now they're being forced to address OT risk, which is something that is very hard to quantify with traditional risk models, right? When you have a very, very low probability of an event, but a very, very high, maybe unquantifiable, risk, right? And how do you normalize that across an industry, which is the core business that insurers do? So we've seen this progression over the last few years where insurers were trying to get more savvy, right? They were assessing risk profiles through either technology investment, monitoring, third-party risk governance programs. But at the end of the day, it kind of just boiled down to a questionnaire that you passed around, right, and hope for the best. And then Colonial Pipeline happened. And we saw a couple of major insurers react to that, right? Lloyd's of London flat out said, hey, if you're a victim of a nation state attack, we're not covering you, right? And it's just because that risk to probability equation, it just doesn't work out, right? But as we were talking about earlier, I think the main risk here to at least this industry, at least in the immediate, is criminal ransomware, right? Something that can happen very easily, and we should have preventative controls already in place for this type of thing. So we've seen now this risk imbalance, traditionally where we were outsourcing risk in the industry, that equation no longer makes sense. So insurers are saying, hey, we're gonna increase your rates, we're gonna lower your liability coverage. Oh, and by the way, now you have to prove a whole laundry list of technical controls. And we're seeing organizations that either don't feel the need to comply or are doing their own equation and saying, hey, the effort that I have to put in doesn't quite balance with what I'm getting out of this. So I'm going to self-insure or find different ways to mitigate the risk. And it hasn't hit yet, but I think it's really going to shake up the industry. And I'm curious your thoughts on all of that, right? How do we improve that model? How do we adapt to that current model today? What does this look like?
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
So I've got two sort of trains of thought. The first one is around the whole discussion, and it's somewhat of a, I don't know if I want to use the term confrontational, but it's a tense conversation about, do you pay the ransom or not, right? And this is where the insurers, historically, you could actually get coverage that covered your ransomware payments, right? So if a criminal ransomware event happens in your company, yeah, you had some insulation there. You had some padding because you knew your insurance would cover it. Most of the carriers are now stopping that practice, right? And because it's kind of like enabling or, I don't think you want to pay into the profitability of these organized crime organizations, right? So I think that's a good trend, that we're no longer by default kind of enabling that. However, I do recognize that when you have a ransomware event like that, that's a very unique decision that needs to be made by each company. I'm never going to be able to tell the CEO of a company whether they should pay or they shouldn't pay without understanding the position they're in. Because in some cases, it's cheaper to pay to get things back running. However, these are criminals, right? So you're never guaranteed success. So that's kind of the first thing. I'm happy to see that we have a trend away from sort of the default of paying the ransomware. The next piece, I think, comes down to that visibility concept that we talked about previously. And that's where we actually see insurers coming to Tenable. And, you talked about it kind of boiled down to the questionnaire, right? So it's like you had the clipboard, you had the questionnaire, you gathered data. It's like, oh, do you have a risk management plan in place? Yes. Do you have an asset inventory in place? Yes. Okay, tick the box. Mm-hmm. We're actually seeing insurers come to Tenable now that want live access to the customer's cybersecurity data. Of course, the customer has to approve and enable that, but the insurance company's algorithms themselves can tie into our systems to extract that data so that the insurer gets the confidence that they not only have the process and procedure in place to manage the cybersecurity, but they see the KPIs, the key performance indicators online and live, so they can monitor basically the performance from a cybersecurity basis. And of course, we see that primarily on the business or IT side of the house right now. There is no doubt in my mind, Jonathan, that that's going to start to include the operational technology, because as we said before, that's where the money's made.
Absolutely. And to trail off that, you hit the nail right on the head. And this may be a little preemptive for the market, but we're seeing the same thing, right? Siemens Energy runs a managed cybersecurity service for our customers. And one of the things that we've seen is underwriters now having a desire to prove things like visibility uptime, what things were identified in a given period, analyst investigations and reports. It's things that traditionally have existed on the IT side, now migrating into the OT side of things. And where that takes us is very interesting. It's just, of course, in the short term, the maturity isn't quite there. That is where I would love to see things go. Because, as you mentioned, visibility is key here. It is the thing that allows decision-making in an event. It allows decision-making prior to an event. And it is ultimately the thing that will give you confidence in an incident response and recovery scenario to make effective and timely decisions. So I couldn't stress the importance of what you said anymore.
And I think the bottom line here, for our joint customers, that's why the partnership between Siemens Energy and Tenable is so important, because we need that end-to-end visibility before, during, and after these kinds of events.
Absolutely.
So those are some great points. So Marty, if you don't mind, let's go deeper into that and touch up on how companies are trying to get out of the trap of being reactive and move more towards a proactive stage when it comes to cybersecurity.
It's another very good question, and so when I was the director of the Industrial Control Systems Cyber Emergency Response Team at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, one thing that my teams, when they responded to an incident, would always find is they had to basically go in and reverse engineer the network diagrams and the placement of all of these assets. They spent less time responding to the incident. They spent more time trying to figure out what the landscape looked like. What does this network look like? Where is the attacker in this environment, right? And so I don't know why, but in the last 10 years, and I think from a sector by sector perspective, energy has been particularly guilty of this. We've spent a lot of money on incident response or threat hunting or what we would call in the industry the slang, and you know the words I'm going to use, right of boom, after the event happens. But you basically have to go back and do a lot of that, what should have been proactive work, to get that sort of lay of the land, especially with some of the more modern attacks that are, living off the land attacks rather than using some sort of specific malware. And so the other indicator that I always saw is that it's going to cost you at least one, maybe two orders of magnitude. So these are like multiply by 10, multiply by 100, right? Mm-hmm. To clean up after one of these incidents than if you had spent that money proactively. And in the case of criminal ransomware, Tenable has done quite a bit of research in this area. Almost all of these attacks are not novel, nation-state, zero-day, crazy, technological attacks. They're using vulnerabilities that are 10 years old. Right? Shame on us if we haven't fixed that stuff that the criminals are leveraging. Right? So I believe that if you're going to build a house, you need to build an extremely strong foundation for that house, right? Yeah, you're going to spend some money on fancy appliances and all that kind of stuff later on. So I'm not going to ever tell anybody they shouldn't have a good incident response capability, or they shouldn't have a good capability to go in after the fact. But you sure better invest in that foundation, the foundational elements of cybersecurity. And that includes all of this visibility that we've been talking about. It certainly includes understanding where these risks lie within your systems. And hey, we get it. You can't always patch an industrial control system at the same tempo that you patch an IT environment, but you better know where those risks lie in your environment, so that if a new ransomware attack comes out that's leveraging some of those vulnerabilities, that you can maybe change your calculus about, maybe we should patch that. Right? So I'm always going to advocate for more proactive investment in cybersecurity in order to hopefully prevent, right? The goal here is to prevent these attacks from happening. But at the end of the day, if something gets through, if you have an incident that goes on, it's going to be much, much easier to respond to if you have those basics in place.
Absolutely. And, there's a couple of interesting threads that I want to pull on there. The first is this whole concept of shifting to left of boom, right? Anybody who's practiced in this space knows that that's the place to be, right? If we can prevent something from happening, so much the better. Because you're right, it's orders of magnitude to recover from an event. And that's the second topic that I want to bring up here. In the IT world, incident response is one thing. In the OT world, I think there's two distinct parts of that. There's incident response and incident recovery, right? And when I say incident recovery, really what I mean is rebuilding the system to make it operationally capable, right? And that is something that even today I see overlooked. And one of the ways to address that is through visibility. Now, obviously, we want to shift to left of boom, right, prior to the event. But regardless, we still need that visibility to make decisions as things are happening to say, we've cleared the system for operation, because there are true mechanical, physical safety impacts that can occur if we bring a system back online and we haven't mitigated whatever risk or threat was there. But driving back to how do we get left of boom? Industry in general has been very reactive. And it's largely because all critical infrastructure in general requires such heavy capital investments, and the planning for it is multi-year process. By the time it gets implemented, I mean, there are systems out there that will retire long after I'm dead, that I've engineered, right? And it's one of those things that you look at it and you say, okay, the cybersecurity landscape, threat landscape changes so quick. How do you address that in infrastructure that just, it's meant to survive for decades and decades and decades? And it becomes okay, we cannot address every vulnerability. It will never happen. Right. But we can put in tooling, and if we're actually monitoring the tooling, if we're actually looking at it and taking some action with it, we can effectively reduce that risk. So not only is it, let's get sensor technology in there, let's make it visible, but let's do something with it, right? Because otherwise it's wasted time and effort. And unfortunately, and this is the final point that I'm kind of leading to here, industry has been driven by regulation for the last at least decade, right? SIP 3 went into effect in 2009, which of course governs power generation, transmission, and some aspects of distribution in North America. And unfortunately, instead of setting a high benchmark for what we should achieve with cybersecurity, it's almost set a low benchmark, right? And what I've seen is organizations, and we all know compliance does not equal cybersecurity, but what we've seen is organizations drive to a minimum threshold when they have capabilities to be doing so much more. Now, fortunately, we're starting to see this change. FERC just put out a couple of orders that are going to change the SIP standards to include internal network security monitoring requirements, actually looking beyond that plant firewall to find out what's going on within your control system environment, which I think is fantastic, right? That's long overdue. Some of our more mature organizations have been doing that for years, and the things that they find are very interesting. It's hardly ever cybersecurity events. It's always some type of equipment failure, misconfiguration, misoperation. But philosophically, that is no different than a cybersecurity event. The outcome of a cybersecurity event in an operational technology space looks exactly the same as an equipment failure or misoperation. So I'm really excited to see this coming around, because not only does it improve our cybersecurity posture through industry, but it also brings in the ability for process engineers, plant management to detect a new layer of capability as to how to maintain their systems. And I'm sure you've got some perspective on this. We're both instrumentation and controls engineers, process engineers, so curious on your thoughts.
Yeah, we could have a whole separate conversation just on the race to the bottom that compliance versus security kind of drives, right? And we both have good friends at FERC and have been involved in this process for a long time. But I think one thing I want to kind of expand on that you said is we've been talking about this concept of visibility. And it isn't always just your asset inventory. It isn't always just what vulnerabilities you have on this computer or on this programmable logic controller or this automation system. What we've also done, and I think it's more of a health monitor than anything, is we actually monitor the configurations of these devices, right, to see if they're changing over time. And that can actually give you significant productivity and recovery benefits, as you said, in a non-cyber way. And I think that if I'm being sort of forecasting or predicting, more and more of our customers want to have that. These fields are going to continue to get closer and closer and closer together. And we just have to continuously monitor the health of the environment. And it's, I use the analogy sometimes. It's very much like the vibration monitoring systems that you have in place on a turbo generator, right? I mean, you're monitoring the bearing temperatures, you're monitoring the vibration, you're monitoring the health of a very expensive machine. You have to do that at the network level too. You have to monitor if the computers and the controllers are talking to each other properly, or you've got some sort of physical layer problem because a forklift drove over the cable. Our systems are robust and reliable enough, resilient enough that they can keep working, right? There's a redundant network in place, but we need to have the monitoring in place so that we can sense when there's a little bit of an anomaly in some of this traffic, or there's maybe some malware floating around on an environment because somebody put a USB stick in. Hasn't shut you down yet. And we know we make those systems resilient enough to work through that, but you need to have that continuous monitoring in place to give not only you the confidence, but as we talked before, to give your insurers the confidence, to give your executives the confidence that you can work through that situation.
Absolutely. And, we have seen this, operating an OT-centric security operations center with Siemens Energy, where, we have had customers who have had to make critical operational type decisions based on that type of information. This is not one of the organizations we service, but it is, an example of this, which is why I can disclose this. So there was an organization who was affected by malware on their control system. They had the visibility into their system to know what malware variant it was, know how it would impact their system, and they were able to make the decision to keep running until such a time that they could address that issue. Right, their incident response could wait until a time where it was operationally convenient. And having that type of critical decision making is invaluable, right? And I'll add to that there's a level of knowledge that you have to have about the control system or the OT equipment, not only from how it works in general, but what function is it of your system, right? Is it a supervisory type system? Is it monitoring vibration for long-term deviations on shaft displacement? Yeah. Or are we looking at a critical trip that would take your unit offline and potentially an uncontrolled shutdown, which of course, wrecks equipment? And having that combined operational knowledge with the cybersecurity IT knowledge is the way that these organizations are going to move forward.
Yeah, it's an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Every time.
So thank you, gentlemen, for that. So that leads us into our next discussion about responsibilities and the shift that we see at power plants and power generation companies are doing and how that affects day-to-day operations. So Jonathan, do you want to lead us in the discussion of that particular subject?
Yeah, I'd love to. That's a great question. And this leads into a topic we've been alluding to throughout. Some people call it IT-OT convergence, but it's the cultural shift that needs to occur to bring our knowledge gaps to a minimum, right? Every organization that I've ever interacted with has a very strong cybersecurity presence that really, really understands their business and their day-to-day business type operations. And then you have an organization that is very focused on operations of their critical infrastructure. And traditionally, those have been two separate pillars that refuse to talk to each other because they have very, very different objectives. And of course, through the, we'll call it evolution of control systems, right? The things that are operating critical infrastructure, they're starting to look more and more like IT type devices, right? We're having to patch for critical Windows events, which, you go back even 15 years, you may have been using an embedded Unix system that
I'm a Vax mess guy.
Exactly, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And we've had this sudden shift. So you look at the traditional OT workforce, right? These are folks who intend to have a 30, 40, in some cases, 50-year career doing one thing and doing it very well. And now suddenly, over the last 15, 20 years, we're asking them to take on this level of administration that they were not prepared for, that they had no training on, right? It was one thing to own the operational process that they were in charge of. Now suddenly they have to be an IT administrator. They have to know what an Active Directory is, right? They have to know how to program Cisco switches, right? And then you start layering on the cybersecurity tooling that comes along with it, and we're just asking them to take on more and more. And every organization I've been to, there's somebody in that organization who has the knowledge to supplement that. However, those IT practitioners have not been allowed into that OT space because there's such a risk, right? You almost have to go into a control system environment with a little bit of reverence, right? Knowing that there's large pieces of machinery, large electrical equipment that could easily kill, injure people, or downstream effects, right, for your consumer, right? Nobody wants rolling blackouts. If you're in the pharma space, quality control is a huge issue, same with healthcare. So you start having to adjust your mentality. And really the point that I'm trying to get here is there is a way to solve this problem, not just through tooling, but through cultural changes, bringing IT experts, cybersecurity experts into the operational technology space and vice versa. And I'm going to pull your brain and see if you've got any clever solutions on how to solve this problem other than just a huge cultural shift.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think as a software company, Tenable, obviously, we want to help people solve the technology gaps or problems, right? But if you go back one step, this is all about people, process, and technology. And people is intentionally at the beginning of that trio, right? So organizational changes, the collaboration between OT and IT. I remember doing cybersecurity assessments almost 20 years ago now, where we would go into a facility and it was the first time that the IT people had ever met the OT engineers. Like, we had to actually introduce them to each other. And now I think we're at a much better place, a much more mature place. It's Gartner, I believe, recently did a study where they said that 82% of organizations, the OT security function is being reported up to the Chief Information Security Officer, right, to the CISO's desk. And that is a trend that I see globally happening. And I get this question all the time. It's like, who should own OT cybersecurity? And, it really does have to be a collaborative, almost matrixed type of environment. The OT engineer, of which, you and I are OT engineers, right? Those functions are almost always going to be engineering type functions, but they need to have a very significant dotted line over to the security side of the house. Because when you're talking about cybersecurity in these environments, you have to have you have to have your hard hat on. You have to have your engineering sort of acumen with you to do those changes. But you also need to be cognizant of the security landscape. And I think more importantly, that information must flow up to the CISO, right? So if you look at some of the changes, for example, that the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission, is making in the United States for publicly traded companies, they're requiring companies to disclose when they have a cybersecurity event. And if you are the CISO standing in front of your board of directors, briefing them on the posture of your facilities, explaining what's going on with an incident, you need to have that real-time, up-to-date information that's happening in those systems. It's not going to cut it if you pull a book off the shelf that has like a cybersecurity assessment that's 3 years old. You need to be able to say, I have 27 of these controllers that have this vulnerability in them, and we have mitigated 20 of those, but I have 7 facilities that are left to do. You need to have up-to-date and accurate information just to validate all of that reporting up the chain. And it's interesting. One of our chief product officers used to say that our biggest competitor in this space is Excel. It's like, because people would take the cybersecurity data out of an OT environment, take the cybersecurity data out of an IT environment, and morph it all together, or build it together in a spreadsheet so you can print out the fancy chart to hand to the CISO to present to the board. Yeah, that doesn't cut it, right? You need to be able to have that data in a common analytical platform. And that's where a partnership between automation people, which you represent here with Siemens Energy, and even though I still wear a hard hat, the information security side of the house represented by Tenable, right?
Right.
We can't do this individually. We must do it together. Now, I'm going to put some caveats on this, right? I think for a long time, when we talked about convergence of people and organizational convergence, it's like, oh, the OT security function should report to the IT people. They go, oh, well, that means that I can just do this all in my IT SOC, or I can just have my IT vulnerability management people, manage the system. No. The function should report or coordinate really tightly. You still have to have an OT engineering expert that's sitting on that incident response team.
Yep.
In your SOC, and I'm an advocate of a combined SOC where you have visibility into the whole enterprise, there needs to be a desk in the corner or a partnership with a company like Siemens Energy to be able to provide you the contextual visibility into the OT environment. Because when there's an attack happening, we've been talking about criminal ransomware all day here. When that attack happens, it's most likely going to start in the IT environment, the business or enterprise environment. And you need to be able to quickly turn to your OT counterparts and go, are you seeing this? Is there any indications that this has bled over into our operational systems? And they need to be able to go push 5 buttons and go, no, we're good. We're going to keep running and monitor that environment. And that's only going to be done through collaboration. So, I see these functions coming closer and closer and closer together, but I also see the specialist functions that are subordinate there that have to maintain their unique contextual roles.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you touched on that, because that is, I think, ultimately the conclusion that we all need to come to if we're going to be effective at addressing this type of risk. It's one of the problems that Siemens Energy tried to address up front. Just knowing how necessary it is to have experts in the operational technology space, because the first level of maturity that you just described is having somebody at the table that's able to say, am I infected by something or not? But then there's that next level of granularity, which is, how would I be affected in my environment? And it's if you have somebody who can sit there and say, this process controller is at this firmware revision, this one is susceptible, but what's it doing? Is it a turbine controller, or is it a air compressor skid, right? Do I have redundancy? Is it 2 out of 3 air compressors that I need? Really, let's quantify the risk to my organization here, because in those type of events, you're going to be limited on resources, right? And unless you have surge support through a trusted partner or others, you don't have time to look into everything. So you need somebody to be able to sit there with confidence and say, all right, this affects me or it does not. And if it does affect me, it affects me to this quantity. And that is subtle in the operational technology space. Most of the type of studies that we do they're really single point of failure type studies, right? Because everything in critical infrastructure is fully redundant, from the network to the process to, and in some cases it's 2 out of 3 redundant, depending on the criticality, for safety systems. And you have to start thinking differently, right? It's not, okay, if this system fails, it fails over here. It's, okay, if I lose this little bit, right, and suddenly my operational or control philosophy changes, how is that going to change the way that I'm operating this piece of equipment or this system? And contextualizing that, I think, is the next big step to reaching that maturity. So, our security operations center, it sits right next to our remote expert center. These are our, engineering hotline, right? When you have a problem, you call them up and they will run you through all the process part of it. But there's no distinction between that cybersecurity and that engineering in the operational technology space. So, I'm glad to hear that that's top of your mind as well. I hope that we see industry in general starting to move that way, that singular pane of glass for both IT and OT, so that you can address those type of risks in real time.
It's an absolute requirement. It's in the past, even on the business environments or systems in the IT space. It's like a vulnerability or an issue comes out with an operating system like Windows. It's like you might have 1,000 of these installations across your enterprise. They're not all the same. The one that is running the turbine controls for the operator has a much different criticality contextually than the one that's over in the closet that's doing something else, right?
Yep.
And for a long time, even on the IT side of the house, there was no good way to do that distinction. In Tenable, we're very proud of the fact that we can help companies understand not only what that system's being used for, but who are the individuals and identities that are on those systems, right? So joining that together can really give you a better visibility into, I need to patch these two first.
Right.
998 of them can wait, but these two I need to patch first. And that's only going to happen through additional information, value, data streams that we can join together. And it's going to be through, partnerships like Siemens Energy and Tenable has.
Absolutely. And I think that was the last piece of the puzzle for Siemens Energy. You talked about people, process, and technology. We have the OT experts. That is what we are good at. Process. We're a German engineering company. It's what we do. But that last piece of the puzzle was the technology. So to have a partnership with best in breed, visibility, vulnerability monitoring, configuration change management in a package or a sensor technology that is specifically for the OT space, that's critical for how we support our customers and industry.
Yeah, and you know what? This is only going to be good for critical infrastructure. So Jonathan, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Marty.
So there's some interesting takeaways there. So let's wrap up the discussion and bring it back to ultimately what's the most important thing, us as clients or customer base. So can you guys speak on, from your side, what's the importance of cybersecurity and how it affects the citizens of this great country?
Wow. If you look at critical infrastructure, and I go back to the DHS days, at that time there were 16 critical infrastructure sectors. Almost everything that we touch in our daily lives is digital. Everything. You cross the street, you get in your Uber, you get in your cab, you drive through a tunnel, you go to the airport, you turn on the switch to get lights in your house, you turn on the faucet for water, all of our groceries are delivered through a digitized supply chain that it's tracking the temperature of the truck that the gallon of milk was in, right? We rely on the delivery of those goods and services every single day. And quite frankly, we've been spoiled, I think. It's like you can get a package delivered to your house like the next day or the same day in some areas. Right? I live in a remote part of the country. But we rely on that. And society as a whole, I think, has almost become more fragile because of that, right? Underneath all of that supply chain and digital delivery of services is this digital fabric, right? And if that is not secure by design, right, we need to build all this into the fabric and not try to just bolt it on later. If it's not done correctly and upfront, ultimately we're going to fail, right? And so we need that real-time visibility. We need to be able to provide the incident responders with enough data to be able to make the determination if they can we make it through this? Are we resilient enough to work through this, attack and ensure that the power is going to stay on? And so I almost am at the point in my career now where I can no longer separate in my head the importance of critical infrastructure and the importance of the cybersecurity aspect of that infrastructure. It is indelibly intertwined in my brain. And I think that that's the message to, the everyday American or citizen of any country is that in order to have that confidence, in order to be able to rely on the safety and reliability of that critical infrastructure, you have to put a huge amount of trust in the company or the entity that is providing that service, that they in turn are partnering with companies like Siemens Energy, like Tenable, to ensure that it's secure from day one.
And, I love that. And I want to stress that there is immense trust that needs to be built throughout industry, right? You look at critical infrastructure and just segmenting by critical infrastructure, right? Pharmaceutical, manufacturing, agriculture, water, defense, all of those are reliant on power, right?
Absolutely.
So I'm not going to say, and I'm biased here, but I'm not going to say energy is the most important critical infrastructure, but it's pretty important. And of course, there's all these dependencies that feed up. And there's quite a few initiatives going on right now around cyber-informed engineering, yes, which is including cybersecurity considerations in the base system, right? Because if it's shoehorned in after the fact, it's largely ineffective, right? And typically it's order of magnitudes more expensive than if you just built it in the first place. So, along those lines, within the US, FERC has been looking at that, right? And they now have incentives out for cybersecurity investment. And I really, really hope that the industry takes advantage of that to start life cycle planning, right? We mentioned earlier that a life cycle of critical infrastructure is 50 to 100 years in some cases, right? There's hydro facilities that I've worked at that are, national historic monuments because they've been there long before I was born and long after I'll be dead. And that those interconnections, the interplay between the end customer, whoever is using the power, the supplier of the power, their vendors, there's a huge amount of trust there. And the farther I get into my career, I used to say it as a joke, I wouldn't be so paranoid if they weren't all out to get me. But now I'm at a point where, they is not an adversary. It's all the little bits and pieces and cogs that go together to make these systems work, right? Society as a whole functions because we have our needs met, right? And we have established trust. So, the ultimate message that I'd like to give to the industry is, come back to the table, build that trust, build those relationships, build that interdependence in a healthy way, right? So that, number one, we'll move farther left of boom, right? As we're putting out systems that are inherently more robust. But then also, if and when an event occurs, you have those experts that you can bring in either from industry partners, suppliers, vendors, third parties, whatever it is. Quick example, right? I was born and raised in Florida. And every time that a hurricane hit, right, as a community, we all knew what we had to do, right? You fill the bathtub with water, you fill up some jugs, you have some non-perishable foods, and everybody kind of preps for that. And then emergency services comes in. And we were prepared for that because we built a plan, we had the support organizations to come through. If you've never experienced that in your life, this will all be new to you. And the first time it happens, it's very distressing. So, again, if we just establish those support structures beforehand, I think that's critical. I think that's what I'd like to see happen.
Yeah, and, I'm glad you touched on the cyber-informed engineering. I used to work with all of my colleagues at Idaho National Lab, which is where that concept came from. And there's no doubt in my mind, and of course I'm biased because we're both in the engineering field, but we must put engineering level acumen into the design of our security concepts and technology and procedures and the organizational structures that we've got into place, right? We need to engineer the resiliency into the systems to be able to withstand that. The other thing that I'd like to amplify is, you touched on the incentives that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission of FERC is building into some of the new plans, and we're seeing that across the board in many, many sectors. And so I know I personally worked hard on Capitol Hill to make sure that in some of the new infrastructure funding that's available, cybersecurity is an allowable expense, right? And in some cases, it's not just allowable, but in order to get the funds, the capital funds to build a new facility or upgrade a facility, you must show that you've included cybersecurity into that design. And ultimately, I think that's the final point, right? Is that these concepts are all now inseparable. Like it or not, and we're older engineers that, worked on the OT side of the house for a long time, and we were very protective of our systems for a good reason, safety and reliability. But these systems have already converged from a technology perspective. The data flows from the controller to the business system to the board of directors. It's already happened. The people already have converged. The OT engineering, cybersecurity people already have to work with the CISO's office, right? So these concepts are no longer separate. They are completely intertwined and inseparable, and we need to treat them like that, and from the ground up, engineer them to be like that.
I couldn't agree more.
So as we begin to conclude this conversation, thank you, gentlemen, for your time today. I learned a lot. I hope you all watching this have learned a lot too. And I want to say, if you guys have any more information or any questions for us here at Siemens Energy or at Tenable, where we have, after the conclusion of this, there'll be an information screen with contact information. Reach out to us. We would love to have further discussions with that. And with that today, I'm going to say, everyone out there, take care of each other and be safe. Thank you.